I'm Haven Burt, 62 years old. I was dragging my tired body home after finishing my part-time shift at Macy's, a long-established department store in Boston. Despite it being mid-June, this summer is harsher than usual. The heat rising from the asphalt makes the air shimmer, giving me the illusion of being in a desert. As I parked my car in the driveway, I noticed something was off. My daughter Shona's car was parked in an unusual spot. Moreover, the windows seemed foggy. My heart started racing. "Shona!" I called out as I approached the car. No response. As I cupped my hands around the window to peer inside, I felt my breath catch in my throat. Oh no! Shona and my 3-month-old granddaughter Dina were motionless inside the car. They were both drenched in sweat. Shona's face was bright red, and Dina's eyes were closed as if she had cried herself to sleep. I immediately tried to open the car door, but it was locked. "Shona! Dina!" I screamed desperately. I could hear the tremor in my voice. Shona finally opened her eyes. In a faint voice, she whispered, "Neil." "Dad." Before losing consciousness again, I hurriedly dialed 911. I never thought the emergency call training I took last year at the local community center would come in handy. Guided by the operator's calm voice, I explained the situation. "Yes, I'm a 62-year-old woman. My daughter and granddaughter are trapped in a car. They're unconscious. It might be heat stroke. Yes, 127 Maple Street, Brookline." Following the operator's instructions, I broke the car window to get inside. I rescued the two from the car that had turned into a hellish inferno and moved them to the shade. Shona's skin was hot, and her pulse was rapid. Dina was making faint crying sounds. While wiping their bodies with cold towels, I waited for the ambulance. "It's okay, Shona. Dina. You're safe now," I kept saying, though it felt like I was reassuring myself. The ambulance siren was approaching. My mind was in chaos, swirling with questions. Why were Shona and Dina in this state? Where was Neil? And what did Shona mean by "Dad"? My husband Frank had passed away 3 years ago. The paramedics arrived and loaded Shona and Dina onto stretchers. I climbed into the ambulance to accompany them. As the vehicle started moving, I gazed at the pale faces of my daughter and granddaughter, feeling a premonition of the storm to come. As I fastened my seatbelt, I suddenly noticed something. There seemed to be bruises on Shona's arm. What could this mean? As questions multiplied in my mind, the ambulance rushed towards the hospital. It looked like a long night was ahead of me. The next morning, I was pacing up and down the hospital corridor, trying to calm my restless feelings. The white walls and the smell of disinfectant made the gravity of the situation unavoidable. Shona and Dina were receiving treatment in the intensive care unit. The doctors were addressing the symptoms of heat stroke, but they hadn't given me a detailed explanation yet. "Mrs. Burt?" A voice called out. I turned to see a detective from the Boston Police Department standing there. "I'm Alex Johnson. May I ask you about the situation?" We moved to the hospital cafeteria and sat down. Detective Johnson seemed to be in his mid-40s. He had kind eyes, but I could sense a sharp observational skill behind them. "How are your daughter and the baby doing?" Detective Johnson inquired. "The doctors say they both have severe heatstroke," I answered. "Fortunately, they were found early, so their lives aren't in danger, but..." Detective Johnson nodded. "Do you have any idea about your family? Is there a possibility someone was threatening Shona?" I shook my head as I answered. "No, that's impossible." I started to say, but then remembered the recent changes in Shona's behavior. Come to think of it, she had become rather reclusive lately. She even started avoiding phone calls. "When did these changes start?" the detective asked sharply. "Let's see, about 2 or 3 weeks ago." I thought maybe there was some trouble between her and her husband Neil, but I stumbled over my words. "Actually, I saw bruises on Shona's arm in the ambulance." Detective Johnson's expression tightened. "There's a possibility of domestic violence. Do you know Neil's whereabouts?" "I don't know. He should be at work normally, but..." I took out my cell phone and checked the call history. There's been no contact from Neil either. "Where does he work?" "State Street Corporation. He works in finance." Detective Johnson took notes. "I'll look into it." "Mrs. Burt, is there anything else that concerned you about your daughter's behavior recently?" I thought for a moment. "Now that you mention it, last weekend, Shona suddenly started talking about childhood memories. Especially about Frank, my late husband." "Frank? He passed away 3 years ago. Heart attack." As I said this, I felt a tightness in my chest. Shona was always close to her father, so Frank's death was a big shock to her. Just then, a nurse hurried over. "Mrs. Burt, your daughter has regained consciousness." On the way to the intensive care unit, Detective Johnson said to me, "If you find out anything, please contact me immediately. Here's my card." As I approached Shona's bed, my daughter looked up at me with teary eyes. "Mom," she called out in a weak voice. "Shona, it's okay. You're safe now." I clasped her hand tightly. Shona's hand was cold and trembling. "Neil and Hector were..." Shona's voice quivered. "They were threatening me." "Hector? Who's that?" I couldn't hide my agitation. Shona broke down in tears. "Neil's debt collector. Our savings." A nurse came in and said, "The patient needs rest." I kissed my daughter's forehead and left the room. Standing in the hallway, I leaned against the wall. My mind was in turmoil. Neil had debts. Who was Hector? Why were they threatening Shona? And why did Shona say, "Dad," in the car? Taking a deep breath, I took out my cell phone. I had to call Detective Johnson. And contact Neil's workplace too. The only way to reveal the truth was to solve one mystery at a time. As I pressed the dial on my cell phone, I steeled my resolve. I won't give up until I uncover the truth to protect my family. even if it means discovering a side of my daughter I never knew existed. The summer sun reflected blindingly off the glass windows of the high-rise buildings in Boston's financial district. I was standing in the lobby of State Street Corporation, where my son-in-law Neil worked. I had barely slept last night. Although Shona and Dina's conditions had stabilized, they were still in the intensive care unit. And Neil's whereabouts remained unknown. "Mrs. Burt?" The receptionist called out to me. "I'm sorry, but Neil hasn't been in the office since yesterday." "Oh no." I couldn't help but exclaim. Could I speak with his supervisor? After a while, a middle-aged man appeared. "I'm Mike Donovan. I'm Neil's supervisor, but has something happened?" I was led to an office where I explained the situation. Mr. Donovan's expression clouded over. "Actually, Neil has had some recent problems," Mr. Donovan said. "Financial troubles, and the company's funds." "You mean embezzlement?" Mr. Donovan nodded. "It came to light last week. Neil apologized and promised to pay it back. But he's been missing since yesterday." My mind was in turmoil. Neil, why? And what about his connection to this Hector Shona mentioned? Could I see Neil's desk? Neil's desk was neat and tidy. But when I opened the drawer, I found an unfamiliar business card. Hector Ramirez, financial consultant. My chest tightened. Was this the Hector Shona had mentioned? As I was leaving, Mr. Donovan stopped me. "Mrs. Burt, I'd like to keep this confidential, but..." Neil had recently become close to a colleague. A woman named Laura King. New questions arose. Was Neil having an affair too? When I returned home, there was an unfamiliar envelope in the mailbox. The sender was marked HR. Inside were copies of Neil and Shona's bank account statements. And a note. $500,000 by tomorrow. Or else. My hands trembled. Was this a threat from Hector? But why Shona's account too? I opened my computer and searched for poker stars. Online casino sites came up. Had Neil gotten into gambling? Just then, my cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello? Haven?" A male voice. "This is Hector Ramirez. I'm a friend of your son-in-law." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you the one who threatened Shona?" "Threatened? No, that's not it." Hector's voice lowered. "It seems Neil hasn't told you everything. Actually." At that moment, another call came in. It was from Detective Johnson. "Mrs. Burt, we found Neil's location. He's at a motel in Cape Cod. We're heading there now." My mind was in chaos. Neil's embezzlement, Hector's threats, and his relationship with an unknown woman. Everything seemed connected yet disconnected. I gripped my cell phone and made a decision. "Detective, I'm coming too." To uncover the truth, I had to meet Neil face to face. Even if it meant seeing a side of my son-in-law I never knew existed. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt. The smell that would normally be pleasant now only tightened my chest. Detective Johnson and I arrived at the Seaside Motel in Cape Cod. Standing in front of the weathered building, the detective turned to me. "Mrs. Burt, it might be dangerous to go inside. Please wait here." But I shook my head. "No, I'm going with you. He's my son-in-law. I need to see him." The detective hesitated but finally agreed. "All right. But follow my instructions no matter what happens." We knocked on the door of the room. My heart was pounding. "Neil? Are you in there?" After a moment, there was a faint sound. Then, the door opened timidly. Neil's appearance was far from the Neil I knew. His beard was unkempt, his eyes bloodshot, and his clothes were wrinkled. "Haven." His voice was trembling. "Why?" "Neil, what happened?" I asked as I entered the room. "Shona and Dina are in the hospital." "Did you lock them in the car?" Neil turned his face away. "No, that's not." Detective Johnson quietly entered the room. "Mr. Burt, can you explain the situation?" Neil collapsed into a chair, covering his face with his hands. "It's over." "Neil, talk to me." I sat next to him. "What happened?" He took a deep breath and slowly began to speak. "Last winter, I made a mistake at work and caused a big loss. I was scared of getting fired, so I used company funds to cover it up. Embezzlement." My voice was cold. Neil nodded. "But that wasn't enough. I got into online gambling. A site called PokerStars. Is that where you met Hector?" "Yes." Tears welled up in Neil's eyes. "Hector was just a fellow player at first. But as my debts grew." "So Hector threatened you?" Neil shook his head. "No. Hector, he was trying to help me. But when I couldn't pay him back." "So you took Shona's savings?" Anger welled up inside me. "Hector didn't know. I did it on my own." Neil broke down crying. "When I told Shona, she said she'd report it to the police. I panicked." "So you locked her in the car?" Detective Johnson asked sharply. Neil nodded silently. "But why Dina too?" My voice shook. "Shona, she got into the car holding Dina." Neil stumbled over his words. I. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Detective Johnson carefully opened it. Standing there was Laura. Neil exclaimed in surprise. A young woman entered the room. "Neil, are you okay? I heard the police were moving. You're Neil's colleague." I stared at her. Laura looked confused. "Yes, but not just a colleague." "Laura, be quiet," Neil shouted. Detective Johnson intervened. "Everyone, please calm down. Mr. Burt, Miss King, you'll both need to come to the station." I stood there, dumbfounded. Neil's confession, and Laura's appearance. The truth was still not clear. Neil looked at me. "Haven. I'm sorry. I'll tell you everything. But please meet with Hector, he really." Before he could finish, Detective Johnson led Neil away. Left alone in the room, I stared out at the sea. The waves came in and receded. Just like the answers that seemed to approach and then retreat in my mind. Meeting Hector. That might be the key to solving all these mysteries. As I got into Detective Johnson's car, I renewed my determination to accept the truth and then move forward. That's the only thing I can do now. The commotion of Faneuil Hall could be heard in the distance. In the shadow of the historic building, I stood with Detective Johnson in front of an old bar. The sign read, "Old Ironsides." "Hector Ramirez should be in here," Detective Johnson said quietly. "Mrs. Burt, it's dangerous to go inside. Please wait here." But I shook my head. "No, I'm going with you. We won't know the truth unless I meet Hector." The detective hesitated but finally agreed. "All right. But follow my instructions no matter what happens." The bar was dimly lit, with the smell of cigarettes hanging in the air. The bartender eyed us suspiciously from behind the counter. "Where's Hector Ramirez?" Detective Johnson asked in a quiet but authoritative voice. The bartender pointed to a booth in the back. There sat a middle-aged man. As we approached, the man looked up. "Mrs. Haven Burt, I presume. It's an honor to meet you." Hector's voice was softer than I had heard on the phone. However, there was a sharp light in his eyes. "You're the one who threatened my daughter," I said in a trembling voice. Hector shook his head. "No, that's not true. I was only trying to help Neil." Detective Johnson stepped in. "Mr. Hector Ramirez, you're under arrest on suspicion of extortion against Neil Burt." "Wait, please," Hector said calmly. "I'll tell you everything. It's clear that Neil hasn't told you the whole truth." Detective Johnson and I exchanged glances. Hector took a deep breath and began to speak. "I'm a counselor for gambling addicts. I find people with problems on sites like PokerStars and try to support them. Neil was one of them. But you threatened him, didn't you?" I pressed. "No," Hector shook his head. "I was helping him repay his debts. We had set up a plan for him to pay back little by little from his salary. But, Detective Johnson prompted. "I found out that Neil had embezzled money from his company. And his colleague, Laura King, knew about it too." "Laura?" I exclaimed in surprise. Hector nodded. "Laura was blackmailing Neil. She demanded half of his salary in exchange for keeping quiet about his fraud." "No way." I was at a loss for words. "Neil was cornered," Hector continued. "He tried to access his wife's savings. I tried to stop him. But Neil didn't listen." Detective Johnson finished the sentence. Hector nodded sadly. "Yes. And then he tried to threaten his wife. I was trying to prevent that." In my mind, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. "So that's why you sent that memo?" "Yes," Hector said. "It was to urge Neil to tell the truth. But he panicked and Detective Johnson stood up. "Mr. Ramirez, I'd like you to come to the station to discuss this in more detail." Hector nodded compliantly. "Of course. I'll tell you everything." As we were leaving the bar, I asked Hector, "Why did you try so hard to help Neil?" Hector looked at me with sad eyes. "I once had a son like Neil. He took his own life. I didn't want to see the same tragedy happen again." His words made my chest tighten. As we stepped outside, the hustle and bustle of Boston enveloped us. The bell of Faneuil Hall rang, reminding us of the weight of history. The truth was coming to light. But this wasn't the end. Neil, Shona, and little Dina. The future of our family was still uncertain. As I got into Detective Johnson's car, I steeled my resolve to accept the truth and move forward. That's the only thing I can do now. The morning air of September carried a hint of autumn. I was in my kitchen, making coffee while gazing out the window. The leaves on the trees were starting to change color. The season of change. Just like our family. 2.5 months had passed since that day. Neil had been indicted for embezzlement and attempted extortion, and was currently on trial. Laura had also been arrested as an accomplice. Hector was cooperating as a witness and continuing his support activities for gambling addicts. Shona and Dina had fully recovered and were now living with me. I'm constantly amazed by my daughter's strength. She had started attending psychological counseling with support from the Massachusetts Office of Victim Assistance. "Mom, you have that YWCA meeting this afternoon, right?" Shona came down the stairs, holding the baby. "Yes, that's right," I smiled. "I'm looking forward to volunteering for domestic violence victim support." Shona smiled back gently. "Mom, thank you so much for everything you've done for us." I hugged my daughter, cutting off her words. "Of course. That's what family is for." Dina let out a small laugh. Her innocent smile gave me hope. In the afternoon, I headed to YWCA Boston. As I entered the building, I saw women of various ages and races gathered. Each of them carried their own story. "Hello, everyone," Sarah, the leader, called out. "Today, we have a new member joining us. Haven, could you please introduce yourself?" I took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Hello. I'm Haven Burt," my voice trembled slightly. "My family also experienced domestic violence. But we've overcome it, and now I'm here." The participants looked at me with warm eyes. "I want to turn this painful experience into strength," I continued. "If I can be of help to someone." As I struggled for words, Sarah gently placed her hand on mine. "Haven, your experience will surely be a beacon of hope for many people." After the meeting, on my way home, I looked up at the sky. The setting sun was peeking through gaps in the clouds. Life is unpredictable. Sometimes it's cruel and unreasonable. But we have to keep moving forward. For our family. And for ourselves. When I arrived home, Shona and Dina were there to greet me. Our small home but filled with love. "Welcome back, Mom," Shona said. "How was it today?" I hugged my daughter and granddaughter. "It was wonderful. It was a day of new beginnings." Outside the window, the sun was setting. "Tomorrow, a new morning will come. And we will move forward, one step at a time, but surely." That's our story. A story